So, minor prophets. I thought, how do you start giving an overview to 12 books that most people um, have to think really hard and go through like the little tune to even remember the names of them in order? Because I don't know that I've ever heard a Bible study or a sermon based entirely on the minor prophets. Did you know that in Hebrew scriptures, they are all one book? It's called the Book of the 12. And they are not all in one time period. They cover about 300 or so years of the history of the people of God. And their message goes back well before their own time. In fact, I'd like to start with the theological background of the prophets, and that sends us all the way back to Deuteronomy. When the people were about to enter the land, the heart of the minor prophets' messages, which all tie in together and weave through this one basic concept. If you look at Deuteronomy 30, we'll start in verse 11. For this commandment that I command you today is not too hard for you, neither is it far off. Is not in the heavens, that you should say, who will ascend and bring it down, that we may hear it and do it? Neither is it beyond the sea, that you should say, who will go over the sea for us and bring it to us, that we may hear it and do it? But the word is very near you. It is in your mouth and in your heart, so that you can do it. See, I have set before you today life and good, death and evil. If you obey the commandments of the Lord your God that I command you today, by loving the Lord your God, by walking in his ways, and by keeping his commandments and his statutes and his rules, then you shall live and multiply, and the Lord your God will bless you in the land that you are entering to take possession of it. But if your heart turns away, and you will not hear, but are drawn away to worship other gods and serve them, I declare to you today that you shall surely perish. You shall not live long in the land that you are going over the Jordan to enter and possess. I call heaven and earth to witness against you today that I have set before you life and death, blessing and curse. Therefore, choose life that you and your offspring may live, loving the Lord your God, obeying his voice and holding fast to him. For he is your life and length of days, that you may dwell in the land that the Lord swore to your fathers, to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob, to give to them. Now, this was the premise for entering the promised land. And of course, we spend a lot more time looking at the stories of how that unfolded. And we know which way they more than not often chose. They did not choose life and good as often as they chose death and evil. So God sent prophets. And the period we're going to be looking at, he is sending them to a divided kingdom. They have already fragmented into two different kingdoms because of their sins. And what happens? We read in First and Second Kings, First and Second Chronicles, and all these times it says, and this king led them astray to idols and did not live according to the ways of David, is what's usually the standard said. That they did not love the Lord their God, obey his voice, and hold fast to him. And the natural consequence of that is if you don't choose the one, you get the other. So you don't choose life and blessing, you get death and cursing. And that is one of the things that people have the hardest time with about the 12 minor prophets is that they do not mince words about the consequences of people's choices. They preached against social injustice, spiritual unfaithfulness, things like that. And they told people of the sure consequences of their choices. You choose good, it leads to life. You choose evil, it leads to death. And they also are reminding people of the character and the power of God. They preach against idolatry because these are useless gods. And they preach to all people. This is one thing you will find popping up again and again in the minor prophets, that God is not just the God of Israel and Judah, but he is God over all nations, which is really something to say because in this historical background of the 12, we have things like the Assyrian Empire, the Neo-Babylonian Empire, the Medo-Persian Empire, all of these successive world powers. And throughout the minor prophets, God is telling them, I am sovereign over even these. And that becomes a problem for God's people because these are mistreating every nation. They trample, they slaughter, they are evil people. And yet God says, I am using these people as my instruments to judge you. And of course, God's people are like, but we're God's people. We're better than them. How can you possibly, that's one of the things that the minor prophets are sent to explain. So as a general, just a summary of who we're going to be looking at, I'm going to be lumping these in roughly chronological order, which is not the order you will find them in the Bible. We have a period of pre-exile prophets. This is during the period where the Assyrian Empire is dominant. And under this heading, we have, of course, Jonah. Everyone, it's like the only minor prophet everybody seems to know, right? Because it's a good story. It's a hard story, but it's a entertaining story as well. Who is sent actually to the Assyrian Empire to preach repentance. And the theme you find most often in that one is that God's compassionate forgiveness is not just for us, it's for them. Jonah doesn't like that. We also, under this heading, we have Amos. We know very little about him except that he was from a place called Tekoa, and he was a herdsman and dresser of sycamore fig trees, in his own words. And he is sent to tell them something equally hard. God's judgment is for us as well as for them. You have Hosea. All we know about him is his father was a man named Beeri, and he had a really difficult mission ahead of him. He was not just sent to preach, but to be an object lesson. Hosea was the one who was told to marry a prostitute and to have children of unfaithfulness. As a living example of how God's redeeming love perseveres in spite of his people's ongoing and willful unfaithfulness to him. And then the fourth one in this category, Micah. Now we do talk about Micah a fair amount because he has a couple of messianic prophecies that pop up in the New Testament, but we don't really delve into Micah's words in general. We only know where he's from. It's a place called Moresheth Gath in Judah. And he tends to tell them more things like God's judgment exists alongside his salvation, that he will bring out a remnant of his people who will be truly faithful. And that's one of the themes you will find. Sometimes you get a little numbed by all of the condemnation that you find in the prophets. But alongside the judgment of evil is always woven through the subject of his salvation. There will always be someone that God pulls out of the wreckage, if you will, of his people's mess. I don't even know a better way to say it. They make a mess of everything, and yet he still pulls out a few who will be faithful to him. So pre-exile, right, those four. And then we have four who are assumed more or less to have been preaching during the period of the exile. This is when the Neo-Babylonian Empire has crushed the Assyrians and then proceeded to take over the world, basically. And during this period, we have Zephaniah and Nahum, Habakkuk, and Obadiah assumed. A lot of these, we don't know a whole lot about them, but based on the content of their message, scholars kind of assume they fit in during this period. Now, Zephaniah, it could possibly be, based on the genealogy that is given him in his introduction, could have been the great-grandson of the King Hezekiah. We don't know for sure if it's that Hezekiah, but it might be. And he emphasizes very strongly the concept of the day of the Lord, which you will find in a number of the minor prophets. The day of the Lord, we'll have to talk about that in more depth later, but the day of judgment on sin and of blessing on obedience. Now, we tend to think of the day of the Lord strictly in terms of the end day, the last day, when Jesus comes to return. But in the minor prophets, the day of the Lord is often considered just a day of great catastrophe, where God finally brings about what he has been warning. But to be honest, every instance of that kind of day of the Lord foreshadows the last, the greatest day of the Lord. And of course, you've got Nahum, who kind of is like a mirror to Jonah, because he talks about God's power and anger over sin as evidenced in the overthrow of Nineveh. Jonah preached repentance to Nineveh, and in his time they repented, but by the time Nahum comes along, Nineveh has received its due judgment. The Assyrian Empire has been destroyed. I rather like Habakkuk, to be honest. I've gotten rather attached to that book because it's a dialogue between a deeply troubled and confused prophet and his God, trying to come to grips with God's sovereignty, with his wisdom, which is to us unfathomable, and the timing of his justice and the way he carries it out. And then there's Obadiah. Obadiah, I have a hard time fitting in because he's not talking to God's people really much at all. He's talking to Edom. And if you remember from your Old Testament history, Edom was the descendants of Esau, the twin that was rejected by God. And when Judah fell, Edom gloated. And Obadiah has something to say about that from God. And then, of course, you have the remaining four, which are considered to be post-exile. The first two, Haggai and Zechariah, actually worked together during that time to prophesy to the people who were returning. You actually see them mentioned in the books that deal with the return from exile, like Nehemiah and Ezra. They are talking about God's sovereignty over his people's situation, no matter where they land, whether they were in exile, whether they are returning and facing difficulties, and God's desire for a renewed relationship with his people, his ongoing concern for them as their king and their shepherd. And of course, we have Joel. Joel's kind of hard because it's hard to figure out if he's talking about actual locusts or if the locusts are like a metaphor for something else. But the theme in there is really God's covenant faithfulness. Now, we talk about God's faithfulness quite often in terms of how he is good to us when we don't deserve it. But there's more. God will be faithful to his covenant for good and for bad. What he promises, he will carry out. He may use surprising means, but he will fulfill the covenant with his people. And of course, then you end with Malachi, who talks about God's love and his judgment, and he juxtaposes this against the people's neglect and their faithlessness and their attempt to pretend that they are being faithful when they are anything but. And I decided to go with this for second quarter because the 12 minor prophets are the backdrop of the New Testament. You can go through very nearly every one of these books and find something that was quoted in the New Testament. And the ones that don't get quoted directly still reveal to us the character of God and how constant it remains throughout the generations. I mean, we started in Deuteronomy with this life and death, blessing and curse, and it goes on that way throughout the history of his people, whether they are in the land he promised them, whether they are scattered to the winds, no matter where they are, he continues to send them his word, saying, I set before you life and death, blessing and curse, so choose life. And in these minor prophets, we have the opportunity to hear him pleading with his people to do what is right. We hear him scolding his people for doing what is wrong, despite being told again and again and again. They won't be told. And yet you see him loving them in spite of their rejection. And of course, today, of all days, we know how that story culminated. Because he keeps promising, and then the promise comes true. He sends one who's going to take those sins, fulfill the original covenant, and establish a new covenant in his blood. And he will be the God of all nations. And he will bring about the day of the Lord, for which we continue to wait. but now to wait in hope because he has sent us his salvation.